Welcome to Tech Empire. I'm your host, Michael Quet. Today we have on the show Tauriq Jenkins, Leslie London, and Nadine Dirks to discuss the controversial construction of a new Amazon headquarters on indigenous land in Cape Town, South Africa. This is shaping up to be an important and iconic struggle against digital colonialism in the global South, something to keep a close eye on. Tauriq is chair at AIXARRA, Restorative Justice Forum, Center for African Studies at the University of Cape Town, and a member of the Goringhaicona, Khoi Indigenous Traditional Council. Leslie is a professor heading the School of Public and Family Medicine at the University of Cape Town and chairperson of the Observatory Civic Association, which has actively opposed the development project. Nadine Dirks is campaign organizer for the Lisebeek Action Campaign. Tauriq, Leslie, Nadine, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
All right, so in the last episode, we spoke with a journalist, Louise Matsakis, about Amazon's exploitation of workers in the global South. Today, we're going to be digging into the company's new headquarters in Cape Town. The project, which costs over 4 billion rand, which is more than 300 million US dollars, is being opposed by some South African indigenous groups who say the land is sacred and should be declared a World Heritage Site. This will go to the South African courts, if I'm correct here, and we'll be digging into what the controversy is about. Tech Empire is part of the Yale Podcast Network and can be found on SoundCloud, iTunes, and YouTube. On Twitter, visit Tech Empire Cast. All right, so let's just start with the basic question. We've seen a lot of coverage about this in the media. The Wall Street Journal ran a big piece on it, and obviously in the South African press. What's going on with the construction of this new Amazon headquarters in Cape Town? Maybe we'll start off with Leslie.
I'll kick off. So Amazon are the anchor tenant to this development, which originated when land that was public land was sold to private owners, the people who ran a golf club actually on the land. It was railway land. They then started a speculative process of developing a proposal to redevelop it, which would require the river to be infilled, the floodplain to be infilled, and 150,000 square meters of concrete to be placed on it. It's a very dense development, up to 40 meters high, certainly the highest in the entire area. And it's part of a park, it's part of an urban park, and a particularly important heritage site, and also very environmentally sensitive. Amazon occupies the bulk of Precinct 2, and without Amazon, the project will not go ahead, and that's been said by the developers themselves in their court papers.
Okay, so if I'm looking at this from, I never heard of this before, there is this land here. It's historically, it has a lot of history there going on, for lack of better words, and it's also a place which many believe should be protected for biodiversity. There's a coming together of two rivers. So, Tauriq, can you tell us a little bit about, or Nadine, either one, what's the historical significance of this, place?
Okay, I don't know if you want to go first, Tauriq, or shall I go?
Go for it, Nadine.
Okay. So the area in of itself, we know that the space has been the site of many wars against colonization, which I'm sure Tauriq is in a way better position to tell you about in depth. However, aside from that, I think what people don't realize is how important water is to the indigenous way of life, and more so than what you would think, as in to drink and to sustain our lives. but also it is a place of play. All over South Africa, all over Southern Africa, where there are places where you find water, be it seawater or fresh water, doesn't matter. It is a place where we come together and we pashla, which is a sort of a play, and a sort of an acknowledgement as well of the ancestors who, you know, lived here before we did and walked on the same soil and, you know, as we do now. And so there's that element of the land and the water to begin with. But that site in particular is also a place where unions took place. So I suppose what people would now consider a marriage is what our people did on that land as well. And so to strip away that part of the land and just look at it as just an empty lot or a place that needs development ignores all of us in this city and in this country who are still very much alive and have no say in what happens in this land. And I think, you know, people don't consider that. They don't consider that we are still alive. You know, when people speak about Indigenous people, they talk about us as if, you know, it's some sort of myth or mythical creature that doesn't exist anymore. And we are very much still alive. Thank you.
Yeah. So Tauriq, could you tell us a little bit about what you'd like to add in and on that, and especially just a little history for also for the audience, right? Like there was conflict between the Indigenous people and the Portuguese in this area, and then obviously Jan van Riebeeck, who came to colonize the Cape. That it's also a historic site there as well on behalf of the Dutch East India Company. And when we think about this too, there's this kind of symbolism, if you want to think of it that way, too, Amazon coming in as a big multinational. So could you speak a little bit to this?
Thanks, Michael. This particular precinct is considered an epicenter of liberation and resistance in our country. It's the place where on the 1st of March 1510, the indigenous Khoi groups defeated the Portuguese, then headed by Francisco de Almeida, who was the first viceroy to India under the Portuguese administration. He sacked India, pretty much controlled East and West Africa at the time, came around the Cape of Good Hope, anchored at Table Bay, moved up along the embankments, and then in what's known as today's Odumolan, raided that kraal, and then was met by a standing Khoi army that defeated him and killed him and about 18 of his captains and 87 of his men. This particular incident, which Western historians have kind of brushed off as a kind of obscure battle, was really significant in that it actually stopped the Portuguese from ostensibly creating a Portuguese slave colony in what is today South Africa. But then we move from that 1510 battle. Later on, we encounter the world's largest company, then the Dutch East India Company. They, along these embankments, gifted land for the first time to the employees, the freeburgers. And what's important about this is that they gifted the land through the deployment of Roman Dutch law via title deeds. So we can definitively place where land was ostensibly stolen for the first time and justified by Roman Dutch law in terms of land theft. When the occupation then started and the expansion of the land along these embankments began to move further, we saw the dislocation of indigenous people from the river, and a war broke out as a result. At that time, remember, these were the first commercial farms that were established by the Dutch East India Company, and the Dutch required labor to till the topsoil, and therefore we saw the importation of slaves from around its colonies, Java, Madagascar, Goa, Indonesia, East and West Africa, and here a population that was forcibly removed from the oceans came to this embankment, intermingled with the Khoi and the Dutch, and today form part of a very important descendant tributary group that are related to the San and Khoi in the Western Cape and around South Africa. But what's important is that the first frontier war broke out in 1659. This precipitated over a 180-year period through 16 different Khoi and San wars of liberation and resistance. It resulted in the eventual genocide of the Cape San, which is an unrecognized genocide in this country, and also the extirpation, extinction of sacred animals like the blue buck, the quagga, the Cape lion. So for us, we recognize this as our ground zero precinct. It is our place of beginning to say this is where the original sin happened. This is where restorative justice must happen. It's a site that's been marked for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the San and Khoi to look at the intergenerational trauma, the incidences as it first happened in our country of dispossession, dislocation, occupation, genocide, massacre, ethnicide, linguicide, etc. And it's a site that is currently undergoing a national heritage grading process. The president last year in June, President Cyril Ramaphosa and his cabinet approved the National Khoi and San Liberation and Resistance Route, which the site is a part of. It's also a part of a precinct that's slated to UNESCO as a World Heritage Site. So what we want is a World Heritage Site. And the irony of having the world's largest company and the world's richest man wanting to put a price on something that is so sacred to all of us means that it opens up a very dangerous precedent for all First Nations and Indigenous groups around the world, in Africa and Indigenous communities around here, because it means that what is sacred will be commodified, and so the historical kind of irony of how history is repeating itself, where we see kinds of mechanisms of divide and conquer being deployed in as far as ways of splintering the unity amongst some of the San and Khoi groups around this matter, and how it would appear that a company has that amount of sway with the city of Cape Town and the province in as far as what we believe are serious flaws and irregularities against clear policy, violations of policy. But as Professor London said earlier, putting 150,000 square meters of concrete bulk on a floodplain is just unlawful. It goes against the Paris Agreement. It goes against any notion that recently, Jeff Bezos may have been telling the COP26 around, putting $30 billion towards climate change mitigation on the continent, or $2 billion out of his earthworks project, when this particular development is an antithesis of what Amazon is now taking the world stage for, making certain claims. And so forth. So this area is deeply sensitive, not just to the San and Khoi, but to South Africans, Southern Africans, and also it speaks to the history of the ancestors of mankind herself. And in terms of our spiritual sense of restoration, of restorative justice, this is our epicenter. This is our ground zero precinct.
Yeah. And so that issue of taking over an area which is and should be considered a sacred ground and a heritage site is made all the worse, right, when you take into consideration the environmental impact. And so core to this conversation is almost like these two elements, if I'm correct here. And the there's been a lot of controversy over this. I have from a post on one of your websites. It says environmental experts, including some officials from the city of Cape Town, have expressed concerns that the project doesn't fully consider the potential impacts of climate change, especially since the plans include filling in parts of a floodplain. and there's the prospect of regular, very costly flooding. There's also biodiversity costs. Would somebody like to speak to the core issues that are there for environmental hazards? Just can you turn your mic on, Leslie?
My apologies.
There you go. There you go.
Thanks, Michael. You're absolutely right. The city's own environmental experts, their scientists, their technical people, they read this plan and they were pretty horrified because this plan goes against all the city's own plans around climate change mitigation and flood management. Yet the city went ahead and approved it, and we think it's because basically sort of senior officials wanted this development approved. But actually, if you look at the evidence, there are multiple climate change policy this development infringes. It's actually not a good idea for climate change resilience to infill your floodplains. You need your floodplains to be able to absorb water, to recharge the aquifer, absorb heat. The idea that you would infill a river is quite bizarre. The only reason why this development is infilling the river is because the original course of the river is a problem for the plan if it is to put 150,000 square meters of concrete on the site, because you have to leave 35 meters undeveloped next to a river. And if that river continued to exist, they wouldn't be able to fit the 150,000 square meters on that small site. So their solution to the problem of the river is to infill it and turn it into what's called a swale, which is basically a vegetated depression in the ground. And the river is underground, because they've lifted up the surface of the whole area. So it doesn't flow as a river. It just exists as an underground pool of water. And when it rains heavily, the water will well up. So what they're essentially doing is removing the original course of the river. And the original course of the river is slated for inclusion in that National Khoi and San Heritage Liberation Route. So it's removing something that is both important for heritage and a water body is important for climate change mitigation. The city's own experts objected to it, but the city overrode it. And we're absolutely convinced that while, COP16 negotiations are going on, this is a classic example of a development decision that puts the economy, puts money ahead of any sustainable development. It's a very narrow view of what sustainable development is.
Yeah, and I would add to that from your website, this site is one of unique biodiversity with rare and endangered plants and animals, from toads to rare breeding otters. The two rivers' convergence is a green lung in an urban world. The unique biosphere is one that is vital for all of us. The wetlands also serve as an important water catchment area, limiting flooding to neighboring communities. So we're looking then at, let's make sure we have a clear picture of what's going on here. Maybe somebody can bring us through the history of this, right? So there's going to be a development project. It's already in progress, and it's in this area. There are a number of actors. It's on indigenous grounds. It's environmentally hazardous. What does this, so we know Amazon obviously is a big part of this, but they're not the only actor in this space. So where did this project actually start? When did it start? And what is it, ultimately? Because it's not just an Amazon headquarters building, right? There's other stuff going on there. Maybe Nadine, you want to take that? Or anybody else can join in?
I didn't quite get the question fully, Michael.
Oh, okay. So where did this? So this started. If I'm correct, this started around 2016, and that there are a number of actors involved, and it's not just like an Amazon headquarters building, but there's going to be other things that are built in conjunction with it. So can you just take us through kind of, naming the names, the areas that are covered, and the infrastructure that is in progress and planned to go down?
So from my understanding, it's going to be a complete headquarters of Amazon Africa. But aside from that, there is going to be like a garden section, as well as an amphitheater. And then from my understanding, what seems to be like, I don't know, apartments or kind of an entire building for other businesses as well to be in. So kind of think of it as a massive center. But the issue with that is, and Leslie and Tauriq can kind of come in and talk about the other, parts of it that I'm missing. But essentially, what I'm getting at is that the difficulty with a property of this magnitude is that it's in the most awful part of our city, aside of the significance of the land. If we just look at the location, it's completely awful. And I think the idea with the whole garden, amphitheater, and all of that is to sort of appease the people and appease, I suppose, rebut the argument about, nature and conserving nature by having, a little garden or whatever they're planning. But the thing that people don't understand is biomes are extremely fragile. You cannot mess up a biome by, infilling a river and then expecting the garden to work as it would. It's impossible. These things are intermingled, and I don't think that's being taken into consideration. But essentially that is the plan. It's going to be a mammoth, property in the kind of the middle of the city, which I don't know if anyone's explained this, but there is massive highways kind of in the center of all of this, right? And these highways go into our city center every day. So if you think of, LA traffic or New York traffic, that is what it's like already every single day, going into these, massive parts where it's kind of the business district of our city. And so traffic's already extremely piled up there. This will only make it worse. And it will also make affordability and living in that area even more difficult for our people who are already not able to live there. And this is not just because of colonization and the whole, 1652, what, all of those things, but it's also because of the Group Areas Act, which was a product of apartheid, which removed Black people from the city center and took us all the way to the Cape Flats. So the parts that white people didn't want, that's where they stuck us. And that's where we remain. And it is 27 years into our democracy now. And that's where we continue to be. So this is a big issue on multiple levels because it's a housing issue, it's an affordability issue, it's a climate issue, there's so many components to this. But yeah, I think possibly Prof. London will be able to tell you a bit more about the in-depth of the kind of building plan and tell you what exactly they have planned.
Maybe I can just jump in quick, just
Sure.
to talk about the initial sale. So in 2015, the National Railway Authority sold off this portion of land. Now remember, the River Club is about sort of 19 hectares, and it's part of a 200-hectare area, which is protected by various conservation policies known as the Two Rivers Urban Park. The particular area of the River Club was then sold off in 2015 to the tune of about 12 million rand, which would include the clubhouse and a Mashi golf course. We then sort of see this same area being kind of insured for about 100 million with the bank within a very short period of time. And then within months after that, we begin to see overtures of a development of 3.5 billion. So one of the key questions would be, and one understands how these kinds of things work, not just here but around the world, is that you can purchase a piece of land which is zoned public open space for a certain amount of money. And the way to become a millionaire or a trillionaire or a billionaire overnight is literally to have that rezoned. So, one of the questions would be, is then how would a bank, for example, be granting that kind of insurance at 10 times the amount of how it had been bought? Were there any other kinds of indications or sureties that were given, say, by those who are responsible for the rezoning, which in this case would be the city of Cape Town, one, and then secondly, we kind of almost see a kind of almost a toolkit of how a piece of land that's zoned for public open space, and in this case, one that's also within a conservation area, would go through, a package. It would basically go through a package of plans, which we've been seeming more public consultation processes happen. So it's almost as though that the political decision of this was given kind of favor, or at least a go ahead, because despite the countless sort of engagements of so-called meaning consultation processes that the civics and the First Nations communities and so on have gone, including a 2-year heritage tribunal, which basically found that this site is at the very least worthy of provincial, if not national heritage site. The heritage aspects of it have pretty much been ignored, to the extent that we're sitting with a situation where somehow this kind of concrete and this kind of development is being allowed. So right now, when you go onto the site, there are builders on site, and in their numbers, it's almost like a mini Dubai, in spite of the fact that there is a court case that's happening on the 24th and 25th of this month, you see that the developer has made choices that they are bent on catalyzing this as much as they possibly can of this development. And we asked the question about that. If, for example, if they would lose the case, would they do what happens elsewhere, where you have a situation where you've got a building that has 6 floors, a developer decides to build a 7th floor, violates the policy, and then loses in court, and then literally says, okay, we'll pay the fine. So has the fine been factored into this, and those kinds of things, I think I'll hand over to maybe Prof. Leslie can also give some insight on the extent to which there has been tremendous dialogue between civil society and the various authorities at so many different levels, around this particular question.
Michael, if I could just add to Nadine and Tauriq's comments. Oops, am I muted now?
Sure.
I think I want to make 2 comments about the whole process. So one is about the question of collusion. So we've seen the way the city and the provincial authorities have really made it as easy as possible for the developers to get their approvals. So, for instance, the city and the province both joined the developer to oppose a heritage protection order issued by Heritage Western Cape. Instead of actually saying, let's support Heritage Western Cape to grade the area, which is what the intention of the protection order was, they joined the developers to oppose the protection order. And they said, no, well, there is an environmental impact assessment underway, and that will look after the heritage. Well, we've seen what that process has yielded. It's basically yielded an authorization and concrete and destruction of heritage. In fact, in the tribunal outcome, the chair of the tribunal made the point that there was this unseemly collusion between the developers and different branches of government. And he made it quite clear, because it emerged very clearly in the tribunal, And it's so obvious that the Department of Public Works and Transport is now trying to challenge that directive by removing that reference to its collusion with the developers. The city, for its part, also opposed that protection order, and they also put a special municipal planning tribunal together in order to approve the rezoning, even though the application had two criteria met that required that the application should be re-advertised. So they exercised their discretion and decided that even though 2 years had lapsed since the first advertising of the application, and even though new information was available, both of which are criteria to re-advertise the rezoning so that there can be proper public participation, they went ahead and approved it. We've seen also that the Department of Environmental Affairs officials who approved the development, they were part of a sort of very strange ad hoc meeting convened by a economic war room structure created in order to facilitate development and remove obstacles to development by the province, convened a meeting to supposedly resolve the impasse with Heritage Western Cape. So there's been a lot of assistance given to the development go ahead. We actually are not sure even if the developers have building plans approved while they continue. Second point I want to make is the lack of transparency. So Amazon were never initially touted as being part of this development. And in the course of the environmental impact assessment, we came across documents in the public domain which showed clearly that Amazon was slated to be tenants. But before the end date for comments, these documents were removed from the website of the consultants who were running the EIA. When we asked them, excuse me, why have you removed these documents? They said, oh, mistake, we'll put them back. So they put back the documents, but they didn't put back the documents that mentioned Amazon. So very strange. So we asked them, why is that the case? So they said, no, it's proprietary documents. It was confidential. It was meant for the zoning application, the other application. It's very funny because actually the rezoning application wasn't put out for public comment at all. Well, it was put out in 2018 and Amazon didn't feature. And by the time it got to the tribunal, well, Amazon was a fait accompli. So there's a lot of lack of transparency. In their court papers now, the developers, both the developers and the city, refer extensively to the fact that Amazon are a key tenant. You know, the whole development will collapse if Amazon are scared off. And today we received a lawyer's letter or the papers from the developers' lawyers saying they're trying to remove from evidence material we've put to the court that shows that in fact Amazon 19 sites it could choose from, didn't have to choose the River Club. It had a short list of 5 and then it had a short list of 3. So there were other opportunities for Amazon to locate its headquarters, not this particular really important site. But yet the developers are trying to remove that from the court papers. So there's a complete lack of transparency and willingness to be open. We've written to Amazon on a number of occasions, never got a reply. So I think they are more or less riding on this. They're hiding behind other people taking the heat. But there is a piece of graffiti painted on the wall of the Lisebeek River, which says, same colonists, different ships. And I think that applies to Amazon. Same colonists, it's just a different ship.
Yeah. And I know that there's been quite a bit of activism against this, and we could speak about that in a second. I just want to say for the audience, so correct me if I'm wrong here, rezoning basically means that you're recategorizing the property and changing the restrictions that are put on it so that you can develop, right? Okay. So this process of rezoning was really starting to take place around what, 2016? 2015, 2016?
Well, the development started in 2016. They applied for rezoning in 2018. They got the approval in 2020, and the appeal was chucked out in 2021.
Yeah, and Amazon, but when does Amazon enter the picture? Is it that we just don't know and these documents eventually just came out and that's how we discovered Amazon is involved? 2018-ish, would that be right?
So there was a basic assessment report and an environmental report. Now this is like a 2,500 page document, a 3,000 page document. And as I was wading through and a number of the other sort of organizations were studying this document, suddenly it struck us that there was a paragraph that then placed Amazon as an anchor tenant. And we have been objecting to this development since the day it was announced, since those plans were announced. And I think, and then as Leslie alluded to earlier, there were inquiries around this, and we saw how, it was taken off the website, and suddenly we begin to get a sense that that the giant tech is actually behind this development. And so right up until the point where the municipal tribunal chair announced the approval of the rezoning, that was the first time publicly that it was actually announced. And it was announced by the city official. It was actually announced by the chair of that municipal planning tribunal. And the following day, there was a spate of public articles from various tech online publications, newspapers, Amazon proudly announcing the establishment of an African headquarters. This was complete news to everybody. We know that they're going to be the anchor tenant, but the idea of it being the African headquarters was a completely, this was one of the silent aspects of the Pandora's box that was deliberately kept from us. And it could, there can be a whole number of reasons for that in terms of why I decided to do this in terms of its PR strategy. But on a sacred site, on a site like this, and also the kind of controversy around this, it definitely asks and begs questions in terms of what, what the implications would have been had they openly announced way beforehand that they were going to, and why didn't they do that? Only for the mayor of Cape Town and the provincial minister to basically say that they.
Oh, losing you for a second. We're still waiting you to come back. Okay, I think we lost Tauriq for a second here. So while he's reconnecting, so we're talking about transparency, and we're talking about the question of, how's Amazon getting away with this? And one of the things I want to ask too is, why not pick another site, right? But before I ask that, on your website, there's in other places in the world, there's been fierce resistance from local citizens to Amazon constructing, their facilities. That raises a question as to whether the city of Cape Town offered Amazon any sweet deals to locate at the River Club, which is the site in which they're constructing. Do we know empirically confirmation as to, how they get tax breaks and various things like that? Can we speak to any concrete deals, or does it just appear that, like you've been saying, that the environmental impact assessments are, favorable, even though they shouldn't be, even though we have scientists who are coming in, and including the city's own scientists who are saying that this is dangerous? You had put it in your website that there's basically a difference of opinion between the city planners and the scientists, right? So is it, are there tax breaks and things like that, or do we think that it's just that Amazon wields so much power and brings in so much money that those high up in the city, in the development space, not in the environmental science space, but in the development space, basically want this to come through?
So we don't really know if there are any special deals going on, but we know in other settings, Amazon wields immense power and is able to extract special deals out of local governments and provincial governments. Amazon already has a special deal from the city for its electricity usage. It has presence in Cape Town already in multiple sites, and there is a contract which basically gives them a reduction in costs of electricity. The nature of this particular site, well, there's one of the consultants to developers who were part of the bids made the point that it's actually a very unsuited site. It's expensive to build there. It's not really the logical place to place this development. So, from our point of view, there's something else going on. We don't know what it is. We don't know whether the developers offered some special deal, whether the cities offered some special deal, or whether it's simply that the officials believe that this is going to be good for the city, bringing rates, bringing taxes, create jobs, all of which could be done if the development was somewhere else. It would be cheaper, it wouldn't be harmful to the environment, and it wouldn't destroy a sacred floodplain. That's pretty clear.
Yeah, and on that point, I want to talk as we get closer to the end of the episode. I want to talk about both some of the counterpoints to the activism, let's call it pro-Amazon positions and talking points there, and then maybe a little bit about the activism. So one of the things Amazon and the city and its defenders will claim is that they're going to create, say, 6,000 jobs and 19,000 indirect jobs and facilitate local development. What do you say in response to that?
So do you want to answer this, Nadine? Go for it.
Yeah, so what I was going to add is that, again, that comes in with the question about transparency, right? We do have a job shortage in South Africa, and the reason for that is, like many of the reasons for the social ills in our country, it's racism, it's classism, it's those sorts of issues. It's the fact that, children can't go to university. We were not allowed to go to school until 1994. So how do you then expect a turnover of well-paying jobs in this country? So that's the first point on that, right? So then the argument comes into play that this will create jobs, which, okay, absolutely fine. But this could also create jobs in any other part of the city. And there are so many parts of the city that, it's open land, you could go right ahead and start building, right? Why does it have to be there is the question. And that has been unanswered. And those people who have made these decisions have not come forward and say, okay, this is why we went ahead and we agreed on the site, for example. But the thing that I kind of keep coming back to with this jobs argument as well is that people in government, I'd rather not say who I'm talking about, but people in government are not being honest with the public and telling the public what sort of jobs will be created. And that's the first point. And the second point is they're also not being honest and telling the people that these jobs will not be permanent. They are most likely going to be created in the building of the Amazon development. And those are going to be, semi-skilled or unskilled labor, so physical manual labor. Once that building is standing, those jobs will no longer exist. That's the first thing on the job argument. And the second part of that also then is that the jobs that will remain are, your unskilled labor, your security guards, which I don't know how it is in the US, but I can tell you in SA, those are not well-paying jobs. And so who will be doing those jobs? People of color. You are not going to find a white man outside working as a security guard in the heat. That's not a thing that will happen. So I do think that there's a level of transparency that needs to be had on the jobs, and it's not being had. And I'm coming up against that as an activist, as an Indigenous person. When I talk about the work that I'm doing, people go, but we need the jobs. They said there'll be 5,000 extra jobs, we need the jobs. But when I tell people the truth about what those jobs will be, according to those who have made this decision, you can tell that people, fall back in what they feel about the situation. And then Tauriq can go on and tell you a little bit more about the indigenous arguments for the development, because he would know more about that. Thank you.
It's just to add on to what Nadine is saying, and I think Nadine also hits really to the nub of the matter. One of the big flawed arguments here is when you're dealing with a heritage site which is also around recognizing genocide, restorative justice, restoration for the first indigenous people, where is the dignity of having the descendants of the San and Khoi dig up a terrain of ancestral value in order to get jobs? So that's the first point. The second point, what kind of jobs are we looking at? And Nadine has spoken to this very strongly. Lowest echelon jobs of temporary workers coming in who will be basically violating environmental policy, carrying wheelbarrows of concrete and being subjected to respiratory diseases in a climate of COVID, and so forth. So the third thing, which is, I think, based on the economic argument, is the whole reason this development is expensive is precisely because it's on a plane. You're going to fill that plane with concrete, create a concrete block. And once that block has been concretized, you then build on top of the block. Now, should the developer in Amazon take the same development in as far as the money that's going behind the development and shift it off the floodplain, you would find that the scale of that development would probably be 3 to 4 times the size of this one, because of the amount of concrete that we're dealing with in terms of infilling the land. Also, to redirect a sacred river, to infill a sacred river is deeply insensitive. It's a violation. It's a violation also to the understanding of the symbiotic relationship that the indigenous communities have with the river, the embankments, and the stars. And that this place is an extraordinary place of significance in terms of our understanding of the universe. It's a place where the South African Observatory is, where Western technology has made so much breakthrough in terms of our understanding of the universe. It's a place on the mound where that observatory was founded by the British Empire, was where the first indigenous communities navigated the stars for themselves. In Khoi, when you call a place where the stars gather, it's called Tamirori Ayes. How ironic is it then to have a man put himself up in a spaceship while at the same time he's violating a place of the stars? And so the notion of job employment is something that is really tapping in deliberately into the vulnerable realities of our society and the misgivings of apartheid spatial planning and a post-apartheid state, which is more of an apartheid state now, as we see the fault lines through this COVID pandemic, remind us that things haven't necessarily changed, fundamentally, and so the economic argument is one argument which needs to be tackled head on, because why do we have to expatriate this kind of violence to force people into a degrading form of employment? I've been, there's comments coming in that there's dignity even if you don't have a job to clean a toilet and so forth. Yes, there's dignity in jobs. I think there is dignity in being able to clean waste. The city is on a sewerage basin. This administration has failed to deal with that muck, and the fissures of where the sewerage actually explodes is in informal settlements. It's in areas that have been cordoned off away from from areas that that mostly are populated in terms of class and in terms of race, and I think that there's more dignity in wanting to take some good detergent and clean a toilet because you want to keep your family members clean and safe than it is to rip up a sacred terrain for jobs, when we know that so much more jobs can be created by simply shifting off this particular floodplain.
Yeah, and on the jobs thing, one of the things that you pointed out at your website, which is lisebeek.org, for anybody who wants to check it out, that's liesbeek.org, is that Amazon also undermines local businesses, right? They self-preference their products on their website, and they drive small businesses out of business. Plus, I want to add to that, just through my own personal research experience, I've done some interviews with startups, and I've asked them about Amazon, opening its cloud center, opening its facilities in Cape Town, and they say, well, one thing they do is they basically poach talent, right? So you have a lot of skilled developers. So if some of those jobs are going, say, to skilled persons, then a lot of those jobs are going to be going to service Amazon instead of a foreign, multinational that's predatory instead of the local environment. And it's interesting to see that Amazon is making these claims about jobs, but you have to also obviously take those things into consideration, in addition to the consumerism that it facilitates. So in terms of activism, let's close out with this. Reverend Alan Bosak, again from your website, reminded us that colonists and apartheid leaders used strategies of divide and rule to immobilize popular resistance. He therefore called for unity and urged people to abandon what he labeled fruitless competition for pennies here and there, and little bits of honors and reward bestowed on you by the new colonialists, and new imperialists. Rather than fighting each other, our fight should be against the new colonialists in 2021. There has been, for anybody who's following this, the Western Cape First Nations Collective, who have pushed a narrative at some of the lead activists in this, basically saying that it's just a small group of vocal people who don't like it. Here, something that really caught my eye was in late 2019, a number of Khoi and San structures who organized themselves as the First Nations Collective made a 180-degree turnaround and came out in support of the development. Thereafter, Lisebeek Leisure Properties Trust Director Jody Auschfrentig, that's my pronunciation, sorry, announced that a First Nations Media Center, an Indigenous garden, an amphitheater for Khoi and San ceremonies, street names, and First Nation symbols would be accommodated in the development precinct. So you have this First Nations collective, which is saying, no, we should be supporting this. The activists who are opposed to it are just a small group of vocal people. And then you have some of the developers who are putting in these an amphitheater and street names and things like this to show that they respect, to make them, for them to claim that they're respecting Indigenous persons here. And that goes then, I'm assuming this goes back to what Reverend Bosak was saying about divide and conquer. Nevertheless, we do know that there is quite a bit of support. So how does the activists, can you speak to some of these counter narratives, and then, speak to the activism and the support that really is going on here in Cape Town? Maybe Leslie, go ahead, or Nadine, go ahead, either one.
Yeah, so what I would like to add is that personally, a lot of the kind of communications and narratives that have, played out has been by a much older generation. There is kind of an entire group of young people who are completely against this and haven't been included in the conversation. So that's the kind of my tidbit of just, my uncomfortability with that conversation and the narrative that one particular group of Indigenous people have, this kind of carte blanche on the entire, development, and also what's going to be, kind of built there for them. And while that's all well and good, I don't think that one particular group can speak for all of us. And to put this in an easy way for people to understand, it's like asking one of the tribes of Native American peoples to speak on behalf of the entire nation, and that just wouldn't make sense. You couldn't do board or give back to one particular group of people. But honestly, Tauriq would be able to give us some excellent input here.
Thank you. So it's interesting. There was a 2-year heritage tribunal, an historic tribunal that was put together when the Heritage Authority announced that they wanted to provisionally protect the site because they recognized the need to grade it, but also the fact that this particular development could ostensibly have, have some serious implications. At that particular tribunal, San and Khoi leadership from representing around Southern Africa came and placed very strong spiritual and oral testimony on as to why this site was important, placed the objections against the development, and asserted that this really is a place of restitution. It's a place of sacred healing, and it is also symbolic of the birthright of the San and Khoi in Southern Africa, including the tributary descendant communities that that Nadine is talking about. And so it is interesting that up until that point, I think that the city of Cape Town and the province had mastered a particular kind of relationship with developers where they could overcome certain environmental problems. Environmental challenges, you have experts. They hire the experts and they pull up some really fancy reports and will justify the concrete block on top of a leopard toad's head. But the First Nations narrative, this indigenous narrative that came in so strongly, is something that that they were not necessarily expecting, nor did they have. And the answer was first by the Department of Public Works. So in this case, the Heritage Tribunal chair made very strong recommendations that people need to meaningfully communicate with the First Nations groups on this narrative. And what happened was that a whole process was then started by the Department of Public Works to interview the First Nation groups to talk about the intangible and tangible heritage capacity of the site from a First Nations perspective. What's interesting is that from that same independent practitioner was soon after or simultaneously hired by the developer to do the same thing, for the site, for his site, and then the developer's report, out of that report emerged the First Nations Collective. Before, we had never heard of this entity called a First Nations Collective. Now, anybody, if you're sitting in the United States or you're sitting in the rest of South Africa, when you hear that term, you think, wow, this is the body that is representing everything. First Nations, San and Khoi under the Southern African sun. Well, that's absolutely not the case. The Goringhaicona, together with the Observatory Civic, has put a high court action to stop this thing. We represent 22 San and Khoi groups, including the Tam San and all its traditional councils. When we talk about the First Nations in the Western Cape, we talk about some of the peninsular groups, like you have the Goringhaicona, then other groups like the Kochokwa, and then there's the Kaikorana, the Khorokhokwa, the Goringhaicona, etc. These are all the sort of the Khoi groups, and in the peninsula. And the First Nations Collective is a group of people who are leaders in some of traditional councils around the country, and are also part of revivalist Khoi groups as well, who have gone into a privately negotiated, brokered arrangement with the developer, where they are saying that we're okay with this development if you give us a media center and a herbal garden and an amphitheater. Now, our position on this is that how can you have a media center or a heritage center on top of a site that has literally now just destroyed intangible heritage? That's not a heritage center. That's more like a cenotaph, signing off a final goodbye to something that is so sacred to all of us. And then on top of it, to have it commodified. On top of it, to have this thing in a contractual form that, this particular collective is going to be in charge of its money, it's going to be in charge of how it's going to be curated, and so on and so forth. So I also believe that when people hear that you have forces like Amazon, the city of Cape Town and the province, perhaps some of the leaders felt that it was a practical decision to go where the power is, and not resist, but try and get what they possibly could get out of it. I think for Paramount Aran and the chiefs that are on this side of the river will say that if we lose the river and these embankments, we lose everything. There's one thing about this thing, is that as the Beatles say, money can't buy me love. The same would apply on this sacred embankment. Let the richest company and the richest man in the world want to put a price on something, he can try. But there is a community here, and it's a community of a very diverse group that are part of this campaign. It includes the indigenous Khoi and San revivalist groups. It also includes civics and environmental entities. And you see the divide and conquer has also been played not just within the Khoi and San, but the race baiting. White residents, for example, who live in this particular suburb are now suddenly being accused of being NIMBYs. White environmentalists are being accused of being sort of conservative, in that they rather want to walk their dogs than to have Amazon bring development and job employment to Black people. So you can see the contortion and twists and turns of particular kind of vulnerabilities in our society that have been expertly deployed, literally to try and mess the sense of unity up. So this group that have been deployed either in for whatever reasons, to rub us, to basically openly say that this is the best thing that has happened since sliced bread for the San and Khoi. In fact, that group has even publicly said that this developer has done more for the San and Khoi than government in the history of our country. They quoted publicly in saying that. This is the same developer who's responsible for what the city of Cape Town likes to call genital projects, which is just a euphemism for catalytic gentrification projects. One of them is sitting just down the road in nearby Salt River Woodstock. And so it's not exactly like we're talking about a developer or a company that has built up a long standing relationship with Indigenous and Black communities in South Africa in terms of building things that are actually addressing apartheid spatial planning, that are actually addressing equity, that's actually addressing Indigenous knowledge systems, or things like that. But the fact that at some point, the developer, the city of Cape Town, required an Indigenous group or an Indigenous person to be a spokesperson, or to sit on their stoep and say, that everything is okay, meant that, it means that, because of the activism that had been pushed up until this point, this was a requirement. And I think that a lot of the Khoi groups some of the Khoi groups who are supporting this thing have not necessarily been informed properly. You ask some of the leaders if they read the basic assessment report, or they have gone into the details of what the developers actually proposing. Goes completely against the symbiotic relationship that we have with the natural systems. And so there's a level of how information has been deployed, of how things have been expressed, which short circuits straight to particular ideals and narratives that allow people to think that this thing is actually good, fundamentally, that people to think that the thing is actually a sound choice for Indigenous and Black communities in South Africa, and that has been a serious problem.
Yeah. Plus, in addition to that, they're probably not well informed on. I'm just going to guess. I don't want to say that they don't pay attention or read, but I would still guess. Assuming that they are in good faith, right? That they probably haven't also read a great deal about all the exploitative things that Amazon does all over the world, from surveilling their workers to destroying the environment. So as we close out here, there is going to be a court battle coming up November towards the end of November, and there is a lot of activism around this. So maybe Leslie, you can close out on this, or whoever wants to answer. What's going to go on with that legal action? What's that about? And how can people get involved if they're interested in this campaign?
So we have basically exhausted all the administrative options for trying to stop this development. We've appealed, and all our appeals have been rejected. And as we say, we believe the rejection of the appeals has been flawed and based upon considerations which are irrelevant, and in some cases not lawful, such as the heritage issues. So we have to go to court. And in South Africa, the basis of going to court is under a piece of legislation called the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act. And we're going to seek a review of these decisions, which gave rezoning and also the environmental authorization, and also the decisions to reject our appeals. But because the development is proceeding apace and the developer is working weekends, public holidays, as fast as they can to put the concrete down, we have an interdict application, in other words, to stop the building, period, until the High Court can review the decision. So it's in two parts. So on November the 24th and 25th, we have 2 days allocated for the interdict hearing. And that, we hope, will come up with a decision to stop the development pending the court having a proper review of all the decisions and having all the evidence in front of it. The strategy, obviously, by the developers is to try and avoid that. I can see from what they've now submitted, they're trying to spend a lot of time of the 2 days in disputing documents. And the longer they draw it out, the better, because they're creating facts on the ground. If people want to get involved, there are different ways. I think if you communicate with our website, lisebeek.org, liesbeek.org, you will A, be able to make a financial contribution, you'll find information. B, you'll be able to contact us and get involved in some of the activities we're doing. So for instance, next Friday, we are going to hold a climate change protest near the site. And the day after our court hearings, we're also going to be raising appeals about Amazon, actually, and we're going to aim to give Amazon our petition of 57,400 people who've signed our petition opposing the development, and you'll be able to sign that petition by going to our website and finding the links.
Okay. All right. So Leslie, Nadine, Tauriq, thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been great to learn about. I hope that this, there's more exposure on this, and that this ongoing struggle can gain more international support. And there's a great, you have a great campaign going here, and I think there really is a shot to, win. Canceling the development site. So it was a joy to have you on and to listen to you all, inform us about this. And thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much.
Michael. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much, Michael.